everyone. Welcome back to the Grow RDH podcast. My name is Katie. I am your host. I am a dental hygienist here in South Dakota, and I started this podcast just to sort of build community around some of the things that us as hygienists face all the time. Hopefully you are familiar with the podcast, but if not, welcome. And if you are familiar, welcome back. I appreciate the support. I appreciate repeat listeners. So thank you for being here. Today, because we are getting into the season of annual sessions, I know in our region of the country, we have sort of this 5-state area. Most of our annual sessions are kind of around the same time, and that means a lot of continuing education courses. And so I'm going to go back to some of my first episodes and just sort of go more into detail about continuing education courses. Specifically today, what we're going to be talking about is how to get the most out of the CE courses that you're taking. I did reference this a little bit in some of the previous episodes, but these are hopefully some practical, tangible things that you can do when you're taking a CE course to sort of inspire you to really get engaged with the material. We've talked about the ethics behind taking really good courses and making sure that the courses align with your practice to protect you. But today, this is more practical. This is how do we get the most out of our CE that we're taking? And it's really important, I think, to talk about this because I think it's easy to sort of, we need the credit, we want the credit, we sit in the course and engage, but we don't maybe always really practically think about how this course is going to impact us. And so this is just a little bit of motivation. This is encouragement to really engage and get the most out of your CE. My first recommendation, we're going to talk about before, during, and after. That's kind of how we're going to split up this episode. And so first we're going to talk about the before. What do we do before we go to a CE? We know what CE we're going to. We have the opportunity then to review the objectives and the speaker beforehand. That's my number one tip. So when you're getting ready to take a course, make sure that you do a little bit of background, a little bit of history, and review the objectives. Most CEs will publish the objectives. They have to submit the objectives before they're approved anyway. And so you should have access to those prior to going to your course. And what you want to do is make sure that you understand what the objectives are. So that way it aligns with your practice. We also want to sort of do a little bit of background on the speaker. This gives you context behind what the speaker's expertise is in. Is it a dentist, a dental hygienist? What are they coming from in terms of a background? What is their specialty? What sets them apart? What gives them the authority to talk on what they're talking about? So when we're doing that, we want to, one, come up with questions that you want to know based on the objectives. So you have the list of objectives ready to go. What specifically do you want to know? Why are you wanting to go to this class? What in the objectives sounds interesting to you? What sounds new? What sounds novel? What brings up, what part of those objectives brings up any questions that you might have for taking this course? And so I think that's a really good way to start because it gives us a jumping off point. It gives us a base camp where we know where we're at and what we know about those topics, but we also know what we want to learn about those topics. The second thing is we want to look at the objectives and make sure that they align with things that we don't know. And we have to do that first step first to make sure that we don't know those things. And if you're looking at those objectives and you're saying, well, I have a pretty good grasp on that, it maybe should, one, make you question, do I need this course? And two, it should maybe lead you to further questions about what more do I need to know about this? What if I already feel pretty comfortable with this, what is missing? What's the missing piece? And then, sort of like I said, tip number 3 in the pre getting ready is looking up the speaker, making sure they have the expertise. And that might give you some insight on additional questions you could ask them. So if you're taking a course from somebody that maybe has perio expertise, but they're also, I don't know, experienced in some, radiology techniques too. I don't know. I'm just sort of coming up with ideas as I'm speaking, but it might help you decide what questions that you want to know, specifically grasping all of their information, even if it's not on the course topic that they're talking about. If you know that they have a background in something else related to the topic that they're speaking on, it might lead you into some really interesting questions that you could be asking them throughout the presentation. So that is sort of getting ready. That is the initial steps that we want to take prior to going to a CE course. Now we're just going to transition into what should we do when we're in the course. And I really stress, I hate lecture. I am a teacher. I'm a lecturer at a college, and I absolutely hate lectures. The research behind lectures is that after 20 minutes of lecture, you start to lose the listeners, right? They aren't engaged. If there's nothing that is engaging them in the lecture, they're going to check out. 20 minutes is about the maximum time where we can really pay attention. And after that, it's really difficult to maintain our interest. And so knowing that, even if I am going to go sit in a 50-minute lecture, I have to keep myself engaged. If I know that it's just going to be straight lecture, I have to go into that knowing I have to do certain things to keep myself engaged. How am I going to pay attention? How am I going to keep myself interested in this topic? And that's why you do some of the pre-work that I was talking about, because that pre-work is going to help you keep engaged. It's going to help you think about, am I getting those questions answered? So the first thing that I want to talk about during the talk is, how do you take notes, or how do you capture the information? And I guess that's the main question. And the answer to that is taking really good notes. So how do we take notes? I know that when we went through dental hygiene school, we were probably very serious about just straight read from the slides, fill in the slides, do what you can. But more than likely, you may not have the slides. You may not have a handout at every class. Some classes do have handouts, some don't. So if you don't have a class with a handout and you did my steps that you did at the beginning, you already have a handout. You have the objectives that you need, and you can take notes based on the objectives that are presented. We want to fill in and look at the questions that you wrote down getting ready. So filling in those questions, we want to, as they're being answered, hopefully they're being answered in this class, as they're being answered, how were they answered, or were they answered at all? And if they weren't answered, then those get pushed to the end, and those are questions that you can ask at the end, right? Because they weren't answered. You also want to write down novel things. A lot of the time, so some of these CEs do include a lot of basic information, and you can kind of breeze through those as, yes, I already knew that. But the things that we really want to prioritize in writing down are things that are novel, things that you haven't heard before, things that help you connect the dots of the objectives versus the questions that you had. So what made that connection really stick out for you? Some really good quotes, if they made awesome quotes and you heard something, you're like, wow, that's great. So write down any novel ideas or things that you haven't heard before. Another idea is to write down additional questions as they come up. If they say something that makes you really think hard or be like, wow, I'm not sure what they meant by that, or that contradicts something that I've heard at a previous CE, or it contradicts something that I heard in school, write down any additional questions that come up, and that will help you sort of kind of keep up with what you're not understanding. It'll help you realize where some of the pieces were missing, and again, help you ask better questions at the end. Another idea that I did want to talk about, and depending on what state you're in, this may be possible, this may be not. South Dakota is a one-party consent state for recording. You can record classes that you are taking in South Dakota because it's a one-party state. So recording classes is sometimes really helpful because you can go back and listen again, and it helps you kind of slow down. Some people in classes, they just sort of, if it's past that 20-minute mark, you just kind of breeze over it or you check out. And if you have the opportunity or the ability to record the class, you can go on Google or any AI tool and get that recording transcribed. And what that does is it just takes the recording and puts it into sort of like a Word document or an outline of the verbiage of what they said. And that's a really good way at the end to sort of compare your notes or the notes that you were taking to the transcribed session. And you might, again, catch things that you missed, or catch things, maybe they went over something really fast and you had the opportunity to go back and listen to it again. So that's really helpful if you have the opportunity. Now, that may be not allowed. If you're at a really big conference, maybe they'll say no recording devices allowed, or put your phones away. It may be being recorded for something else. Maybe it's a really big speaker and they're recording it for intellectual property. So that's their intellectual property, right? And you don't want to steal their courses. You don't want to steal their ideas. And so depending, you'll just have to sort of look what state you're in, what's allowed, what's not. But if you can record, it is one really good way to get the transcription after and just compare your notes to the notes that were there. My final tip, I guess, is to debrief after. And for me, this is the most important step because it makes anything that I learned practical, and it really ties new learning to your daily practice. And so one way to do that is to debrief yourself. And sometimes if you're going with a group, maybe your team or your office went to a CE together, you can debrief as a team. And that would be so helpful because I think it's even more likely that you're able to implement new things if the whole team is on the same page. But if you're not, if you went to the CE by yourself and you're taking it by yourself, that's okay. Debrief alone. And you can do this by reviewing your notes. So you want to go through all of your notes. If you were able to transcribe, take those notes and compare them to your written notes. If you weren't able to transcribe, go through your written notes. And again, go through the objectives. This is after, of course, so you're not being distracted. You're not trying to listen and look at the objectives at the same time. You're just afterwards being very conscious of looking at the objectives and looking at your notes and going through, did this course meet each of the objectives that you wanted it to meet? Also, the questions. Were the questions that you wanted answered? Or did the additional questions maybe make you have more questions? Maybe you have more questions than you did at the beginning. And that's okay. It just means that there's more learning to do. And that might mean for you that you could seek out additional continuing ed. Maybe you go look up an article. You can refer to the references that the speaker gave, and you can go into the references and find where they got that material. And that might help answer some questions as well. And then I think finally, to debrief, I think one of the biggest impacts this can make on your clinical practice is to have takeaways. And you can, depending on how long the course was, if it was maybe 1 hour, you might have 3 or 4 objectives. So try to come up with any variation of number of objectives. So if it's 1, 2, even for a 1 hour course, I think you should be able to get 3 or 4 really good clinical takeaways. And what that means is just set aside all of the mumbo jumbo, additional fluff information, the stuff you already knew, the stuff that was just a really good review. Set aside all of that. And can you come up with 3 to 4 really practical takeaways that you can use in your clinical practice? And I think that's really important because that's the purpose of CE. That's why we have to take CE. That's why we need CE. What does this mean for my clinical practice? And when we can do that, we know that it's a really good quality CE. But even the CEs that aren't good quality, you should still be able to take something away. And even if it's just 1 or 2 things, and then document that. I think it's really good for us as practitioners that we are documenting the way that we're growing and evolving as clinicians. And whatever notes or record keeping that you keep for verification of CE or anything that involves tracking your CE and your content and your hours, keep a record of those clinical takeaways. That's something that you can refer to, maybe next year at annual session. You can look back at your annual session from the year before and say, wow, this is what clinically I wanted to do, and sort of take an inventory of how you met those objectives or how you made those changes, and if the changes were successful or they weren't successful. Because sometimes those changes that we think that are going to be really life-changing, and you come out of that CE and you're so enthused, you're so empowered to I'm going to go to my practice and I'm going to make all these changes and it's going to be great. My patients are going to love it. And then something happens, right? Either we don't fully implement the change as we thought we would, or the change just didn't really work with our office or our patients. But I think it's important that we at least track it and we try to watch and monitor the way we change our practice. And that's the best way that we get clinical expertise, is through trial and error. And when we have our ability to track that trial and error, we're better clinicians because we can know through data, right? We have objective data that we can say, this is what I changed in, spring 2024. And we can look back at that 6 months or a year later and say, these changes worked or these changes didn't. And it's just such a really important way that we grow. We grow as clinicians, is we track our changes and we make changes based on data and research and recommendations from speakers like we do. And that was it today. That's kind of a short one, but I thought it was really important just to talk about. And from the community, if you would like to, I would love to hear what you guys do. If you have a secret method for going to conferences or going to annual, if you have a method for documenting change in clinical practice and sort of auditing yourself and how you make those clinical changes, or you make those, different strategies or different tactics, how you do that, I would love to hear about it. And you can email me or comment on any of the podcast or YouTube platforms, and I would be happy to hear from you. So thank you for listening. I hope you have a great annual session season, and we will see you next time.